Good afternoon and welcome to World of Mythology. Today we're going to explore what people in medieval Rus actually ate, and the answer may be very different from what most people imagine as traditional Russian food. Many dishes now strongly associated with Russian cuisine, borscht, solyanka, buckwheat porridge, beets, carrots, and especially potatoes, appeared much later in history. Buckwheat itself was once considered an exotic imported delicacy. So what did people in early medieval Eastern Europe really eat? Today we'll look at some of the strangest ancient dishes that would probably surprise a modern audience. Old epic tales about Prince Vladimir and his legendary warriors often describe enormous feasts and banquets. Strangely, however, the stories rarely mention the actual food being served. Most of the time they simply say, bread and salt. So what really appeared on the tables during the reign of Vladimir the Great? Was it truly just bread? In reality, if a modern person suddenly found themselves sitting at one of those feasts, they would recognize very little besides apples and pears. The main foods of the time were bread, porridge, and meat, but prepared very differently from anything familiar today. Semolina porridge did not yet exist. Even rice was considered an exotic luxury. In fact, the word rice only became common in Russia centuries later. Before that, it was known by foreign trade names. Rice dishes were completely inaccessible to ordinary people. What about buckwheat, now considered a staple of Eastern European cuisine? Even that was originally imported from Byzantium through Greece in the 7th century. Different countries gave it completely different names. In Greece, it was known as Turkish grain, in Germany as pagan grain, while parts of Europe called it Arab grain. Buckwheat occasionally appeared on princely tables, but for most people, it remained a rare prazdnichny food, reserved for special occasions. So what did people actually eat during the early medieval period? Mostly millet and oats. But these were not the modern cereals people know today. Oats were cooked whole and slowly steamed inside clay ovens, while millet porridge was also prepared from unprocessed grain. One of the strangest traditional dishes involved birch bark. The soft inner layer beneath the outer bark was boiled in water until it reached the consistency of porridge. Birch catkins could also be used in a similar way. It sounds unusual today, but dishes like this were once considered perfectly normal. Another old delicacy was called smokva. It was a thick, dark fruit confection, something between fruit leather and marmalade, usually made from apples and rowan berries. During the time of Prince Vladimir, there were still no carrots or cabbage on the table, let alone tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, pumpkins, or even beets, which many people now think of as one of the most iconic Eastern European vegetables. Even onions had not yet become common and would only appear later. So what did people eat instead? Radishes, enormous ones. Some reportedly weighed up to 10 or even 12 kilograms. They were boiled, fried, baked into pies, and prepared in countless ways. There was even an old saying describing 7 dishes made from radish: grated radish, sliced radish, radish with kvass, radish with butter, chopped radish, diced radish, and whole radish. Judging by old expressions comparing unpleasant things to bitter radish, people probably grew tired of eating it so often. Another staple food across the Slavic world was the turnip. Interestingly, even the word itself may have been borrowed from the Romans together with the vegetable. Peas were also among the oldest and most important foods of medieval Eastern Europe. Ancient expressions about events happening in the time of Tsar P were basically the equivalent of saying a very long time ago. Peas were used for porridge, flour, pancakes, and pies. Another hugely popular traditional dish was kissel, though not the sweet dessert many people know today. Early kissel was so thick it was eaten with a knife rather than drunk. The first written mention appears in chronicles from the 11th century. Originally, it was a fermented oat dish, prepared almost like sourdough. In fact, the word kissel comes from the same root, meaning sour. And what about borscht? Perhaps the most internationally recognized Eastern European soup. During the time of Prince Vladimir, it simply did not exist yet. In fact, early Rus had almost no soups at all. Famous dishes such as borscht and solyanka only appeared centuries later, between the 15th and 17th centuries. Earlier, people ate a simpler dish called tyria, bread or crackers soaked in kvass or milk, something halfway between cold soup and porridge. Bread itself held enormous symbolic importance, but even bread looked very different from modern versions. It was baked without commercial yeast and had a dense, rustic texture. Still, despite the limited agriculture of the period, medieval diets were not as monotonous as they may sound. People gathered large amounts of wild plants and mushrooms. Wild sorrel was dried for storage, herbs were collected from forests and meadows, and edible roots such as parsnip and salsify were commonly used. Berries and mushrooms were abundant, so the tables of medieval warriors and princes were far from empty. By the 12th century, during the era of Yuri Dolgoruki, the prince traditionally associated with the founding of Moscow, several new foods had already appeared. Onions had become common by then. Folk sayings claim that onion cures 7 illnesses. Originally cultivated in ancient Egypt, onions spread through Europe before eventually reaching Eastern Europe. Carrots also appeared, though they looked nothing like modern orange carrots. Early varieties were pale, almost white, and still considered a delicacy in much of Europe. Another new vegetable of the period was the beet. Although many people now associate beets strongly with Eastern European cuisine, the vegetable itself arrived from Byzantium. At first, people mainly ate the leaves rather than the root. Beet kvass also became popular around this time and was widely considered a remedy for hangovers. Another famous food of the era was spelt, an ancient grain mentioned not only in medieval texts, but later in literature by writers like Pushkin. Spelt porridge was one of the most common dishes of the period, sometimes eaten plain and sometimes served with butter. And what changed by the 13th century? What might have appeared on the table of Alexander Nevsky after his victory at the Battle of the Neva in 1240. According to chronicles, Alexander fought alongside ordinary warriors during the battle and even wounded the Swedish commander Birger personally. After the victory, a massive feast was held, and by that time, the medieval menu had already become far more varied than it had been centuries earlier. By July, fresh peas were already in season. People boiled them and often ate them straight from the young pods. Turnips, radishes, and early cabbage also appeared on the table. Beetroots were still not widely used yet, but beet leaves had already become popular and were used to prepare one of the most famous old Eastern European dishes, botvinia, a cold soup often served with red fish. Summer also brought an abundance of wild berries: raspberries, currants, blueberries, blackberries, and in the northern regions around Novgorod, cloudberries, considered one of the finest forest berries. In good weather, forests produced huge quantities of mushrooms. Interestingly, medieval people classified mushrooms differently than we do today. Only mushrooms with visible gills underneath the cap were considered true mushrooms. What modern biology classifies as bolete mushrooms, porcini, aspen boletes, slippery jacks, belong to a separate category entirely. This was also the season when aromatic herbs were at their strongest. The best time to gather them was during the midsummer festival of Ivan Kupala, a holiday deeply connected with nature and herbal traditions. These herbs were added not only to food, but also to kvass. Different herb-infused kvass varieties even had their own names, depending on the plants used. And of course, princely feasts included game meat and fish caught from rivers such as the Neva and Izora. Halibut was considered especially prized. Millet porridge served with fish was one of the most common everyday dishes. And naturally, there were pies, filled with meat, fish, cottage cheese, grains, or berries. Spices were highly valued in medieval Rus. Unlike much of Western Europe, spices there were often more affordable because major trade routes from Central Asia passed through Eastern Europe on their way westward. Foreign travelers frequently remarked that local cooks used astonishing amounts of spices, sometimes so many that visitors found the food almost impossible to eat. At the same time in Western Europe, black pepper was so expensive that it could literally be used to pay taxes or soldiers' wages. One especially famous treat was gingerbread, known as pryaniki, a name that comes directly from the word for spices. Making these cakes became a true art form. Special carved wooden molds were created by skilled craftsmen and carefully passed down through generations. Some gingerbreads were shaped entirely by hand, while luxury versions were decorated with elaborate dough designs that resembled edible works of art.